Thank you. Well, welcome to Adaptation Metrics, Challenges and Perspectives. I'd like to introduce Karim Anagay, who is the Secretariat of the International Platform on Adaptation Metrics, to introduce the speakers.
Okay. Welcome everybody on behalf of the Kingdom of Morocco, on behalf of the AAA initiative, that is a Moroccan initiative for Africa, and on behalf of the International Platform on Adaptation Metrics. We have a very short time with a lot of people to speak about adaptation metrics, and I would like to invite first Mr. Abdallah Moqsit to give us a short keynote on the topic. Please, Abdallah.
It's a real pleasure for me to be with you, and I should start by thanking you, Karim, and also all the organizers to invite me for this very important event. And yes, I want also to thank the sponsor, and I want to highlight that I did have the honor to be involved from the beginning when the initiative started in Morocco. And this is, I think, a good initiative. And why it is good? Because from the beginning of the negotiation, we were dealing with mitigation. And for mitigation, it is easy to consider numbers, metrics. You can speak about percentage of reduction, you can speak about anything about mitigation. And even you can put them in scenarios. When it is about adaptation, it is not a natural term. And we started even for 60s, last cycle, to speak about adaptation, but it was a sort of confusion between adaptation and national development. And not only this, even under this help of developed country to developing country, it was a confusion between what is funded for adaptation and also the head of development. Building a dam, we cannot associate this for adaptation or mitigation or helping decisions. So I think there is total confusion. Then came the indices, and came also then the willingness from the many developing country to say, hey, we are not polluter, but we are not emitter, but we need adaptation. But we should put it in numbers in front of mitigation. And I trust something which is really very important. For me, and in the context of even IPCC, mitigation and adaptation should go as a tandem for a simple reason. It is easy to adapt to a scenario with 1.5 degrees C as anomaly, but it will be too difficult, even impossible, to adapt to the scenario for 4 degrees. We cannot adapt anything when it is already burning. It is too late. And this is, I think, sometimes it is really real time to deal with the numbers about mitigation and adaptation. And we should really attack them, consider them in same process. This is why this initiative is very, very important, and to come with something which is concrete, practical and pragmatic, to provide exact number of these metrics. Now, when we are taking adaptation, adaptation has many attributes. What is reactive adaptation? What is planified adaptation? And what is maladaptation? And we should think about metrics, how to measure even all this aspect about adaptation. And this is why I think the work we are doing can be something which is complementary to any research area about adaptation. I just came from the World Adaptation Science Program, which is an initiative, initiated by WMO, UNEP, and UNFCCC, and even IPCC. But the metrics issue is very, very strategic, and I trust it is not only an aspect, an initiative to give the confidence to countries, mainly developing countries, when they are, let's say, taking in consideration those metrics to build a good national determined, indices, contributions, as well as to show what is the part of adaptation in numbers in this process. Last thing I want to highlight is also, this time we are dealing climate change with what I said, adaptive, reactive adaptation now, and also planified adaptation. And when we are using planified, quickly we are thinking about scenarios, models, and models associated with also temperature, associated with level of greenhouse gases in the air, and so on. But it will be coherent to have also number for and a percentage in the level of adaptation and the level in potential possibility of adaptation. This is, bring us back to the metrics of adaptation. And I think I want really to thank you for this initiative. If I have something to ask you as the owner of this initiative, is to work in direction and to start publishing as soon as possible, to publish as soon as possible, because IPCC is assessing peer-reviewed literature. And this can be involved in a process. The other, why it's in this, and this will be my last intervention, sentence, is waiting the time for you to publish. You can be involved in the work of IPCC by being expert reviewer. You need just a self-declaration to be expert reviewer in IPCC work. And please come with a good indication with these metrics, and I hope that we will provide a good research, good outcomes, good deliverable as soon as possible. Once again, thank you very much for inviting me. And also, I hope that this event will be successful, but I have already the conviction, I trust, that it will be good, because when you have people like Karim behind, everything is success. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Moxit. And no need to say, everybody knows Mr. Moxit is simply IPCC General Secretary. Now we will show you a short video as a welcome on behalf of the Kingdom of Morocco of our Minister of Equipment and Water, His Excellency Mr. Nizar Baraka, who was a former president of the Scientific Committee of COP22. Please.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Kingdom of Morocco is blessed with the 3,500 kilometer coastline and the Mediterranean to Saharan climate, confronting water hazards and water scarcity with the steadily growing population. Since independence, the Kingdom of Morocco adopted to the water challenge with the building of 149 dams with a total capacity exceeding 90 million cubic meters, and ever more efficient policy of reducing, recycling, and reusing water consumption, notably in the agricultural sector. Because sustainable development is the keystone of His Majesty the King Mohammed VI's vision, as confirmed in the new Constitution of 2016 11 and the new development model released in April 2021 to guide governmental action. And Morocco wants to share its know-how in support of African countries, a continent that is the least contributor to GHG emissions, yet the most impacted by climate change. To that end, the first African Climate Summit called in 2016 by His Majesty the King Mohammed VI created 3 regional climate commissions, all centered on the water issue, dealing with management of water provision for the Commission of Congo Basin, water shortage for the Commission of the Sahel region, and ocean water framing for the Commission Small Island States Climate Commission. Ladies and gentlemen, while I had the honor of presiding COP22 Scientific Committee, I had the responsibility of finding ways to facilitate the mobilization of climate finance to adaptation action dearly needed in our continent. The Scientific Committee of COP22 pointed out to the need of developing accurate and shareable metrics to help evaluate costs of adaptation projects and measure and monitor progress. To this end, the Scientific Committee organized in 2016 and 2017 the 2 first international conferences on adaptation metrics that were followed by a 3rd one, also in Morocco, and a workshop calling for a platform dedicated to this topic. The Scientific Committee of COP22 also incubated major initiatives at the continental level, such as the initiative Adaptation of African Agriculture to the Climate Change, facing the challenge of food security. I'm happy to see that these efforts led to the creation of the International Platform for Adaptation Metrics in May 2020 by 5 international partners, with the initiative Adaptation of African Agriculture holding its secretariat. Ladies and gentlemen, on 22 June 2021, Morocco submitted its revised nationally determined contribution, raising its NDC ambition to a 45.5% GHG emissions reduction by 2030 against the business as usual scenario. We can commit to it because we can measure it. I urge you to converge visions to find ways to measure adaptation efforts, allowing for efficiency and transparency to ease the mobilization of their financial support. The International Platform on Adaptation Metrics is here to offer an open discussion and working space. I wish you a fruitful side event. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. And now a little switch in the program. I mean, the welcome word of the COP26 presidency will be done between both panels. So I'm happy to introduce the people of the first panel. We start with Mr. Jesse De Maria Kinney, representing the Adaptation Research Alliance. Ivan Giverts, representing the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research. Mr. Alexandre Magnan, from the Institut du Développement Durable et des Relations Internationales. Michaela Rambali, from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Sorry if I mispronounce your name. Aini Ni Brihesel. Well, you'll be welcome to say after what your name exactly is, from the Race to Resilience. And Henri Neufeld, who is with us online, from the UNEP DTU. The panel will be moderated by Carl Schulz, our IPAM chair. Please.
Thank you, Karim, and thanks to our distinguished panelists. I'd also like to convey my appreciation for Professor Maksit, and also to the Minister for the encouraging remarks that I hope foster a really clear idea about the mandate, the responsibility, but also the support that we have from some very distinguished institutions. I'd like to start this by also conveying that this is an online event, it's a hybrid event, and in these strange times, I think it's important that we recognize the people who aren't here, because so many of these people, including a lot of IPAM members, are going to be so instrumental in making sense of metrics so that they can be used for good purpose. And to that effect, I'd like to ask a few questions of everyone, but start with Henry so that we get to begin this online collaboration. And so Henry, the panel that I'm honored to chair is focused on the science and innovation perspective. So we all wear different hats, we all have different perspectives, but I want for us to be thinking from the perspective of how we're making sense of things from a science perspective or from an innovative sort of approach. What's new? What can we do that delivers and provides metrics for users? And to that effect, Henry, I'd just like to start by asking you, as a person who's been involved in trying to understand, make sense of metrics at all scales, but certainly at the global one, and look at the gaps in adaptation, but consider the gaps in adaptation metrics, which I know that you've written a lot in and your group has written a lot on. But what is your view regarding the key challenges that metrics innovators and scientists really need to tackle? And I'm interested in this response from the perspective, how can they match today's real world, data limitations, et cetera, but also from the perspective of trying to realize that different metrics users have different needs. Could you give us some perspectives on that? I think we need to unmute. And this is the online. Sorry, it happens to me all the time.
Thank you very much, Carl, and I apologize for not being as switched on as I should have been. Welcome to everybody in Glasgow from Denmark, and thanks for the questions. I've been working on metrics for adaptation since 2017 at least, and before that, in my function as head of UNEP, of the climate change unit at ICRAF for many years, focusing more on agriculture and sustainable land management. In my function as head of UNEP DTU's partnerships adaptation unit, our work has been trying to understand how we can measure climate risk. And I think that's the ultimate purpose of adaptation metrics. How can we assess whether climate risk is decreasing or increasing over time? Now, if we take the IPCC perspective of climate risk being a function of exposure and vulnerability to climate hazards, we have two fundamental components here. One is exposure and the other is vulnerability. And I think both of these functions actually allow us to do something that is quantitative. We can look at adaptation exposure to climate hazards from a spatial perspective. How many people are being exposed to sea level rise? That's something we can actually measure. And to some degree, vulnerability or sensitivity to climate hazards is also measurable, because in some ways it has a lot to do with how sensitive people are, how sensitive ecosystems are, social and ecological systems, to the impacts of climate hazards. So if we manage to measure these two dimensions, and I think the vulnerability component here has an element that we can capture through, the Human Development Index, the levels of education, income, etc. So these are social variables that we can also capture to some degree in quantitative terms. I think over time, as we implement adaptation interventions, we should be able to measure how these two dimensions change over time. And in terms of the metrics that we need for that, of course, they need to be smart, they need to be specific, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. But that's all related to, it comes from the business perspective. In addition, I think we also need to be sure that they're aggregable. That means we have to be able to scale them from local to national scale. That means the metrics have to be replicable. Global GDP is measurable at all scales. And that's a very, very important metric for the vulnerability for me. This is just an example, and we can find metrics that are aggregable across these different scales up to the global scale when it comes to reporting on adaptation progress in the global stocktake and in adaptation communications, national communications, etc. I think these are opportunities that we should grasp. And my last point I would like to make is that we already have a lot of metrics that we are capturing. The Sustainable Development Goals, for instance, capture a lot of indicators that are highly relevant to adaptation and climate impacts. And the Sendai framework also has metrics that we can capture and help us understand whether we're making the right progress or not. And the final word is, of course, all of these metrics and all of these indicators that I've mentioned are to some degree quantitative. But when it comes to actually looking at risk reduction, we also need to think about what is not quantifiable. And here we come to the point of evaluation. It's not fully quantifiable to do this, but we can understand evaluation, and to some degree through meta-analyses, through the analysis and aggregation of stories, case studies, examples, we capture a lot of the variation and the change. And I think with quantitative and qualitative metrics, I think we can make a lot of progress. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Henry. I think that you raised a good point regarding the challenges of aggregation, but the potential for that, the potential for overall being able to accept in new data that can really become usable for metrics purposes as things develop. I'd like to take those thoughts and pass this over to Evan, who represents one of the most respected agricultural research institutions in the world, and so has a perspective that's sectoral, but also, of course, needs to engage across a variety of different specific questions regarding, both, as you noted, there's both social but physical questions that agriculture and food systems have. So what would you say from your perspective are the key challenges, and how might they differ from what Henry's saying?
Yes, thanks, Carl. Okay, you can hear, great. Thanks, Carl. Great to be here today. And I mean, certainly there is a big challenge with adaptation metrics. And I think one of the things for me is the context specificity of it. So it's a challenge on the one hand, but it's probably one of the most important aspects of it also, because adaptation is so context specific. And so we need to kind of look at it in both ways there. We took kind of a data-driven approach in looking across different adaptation frameworks across Africa, and found over, my colleagues did, Todd Rosenstock, Andrea Nowak, and others, found over 400 different metrics that were there. And so I think it really points to the context specificity and how different people, or different frameworks, I should say, are finding different metrics that are there. At the same time, we found that the metrics we're more focused on the kind of process of adaptation and on the outputs of adaptation and less on the outcomes in the end. And I think that's one of the things, the challenges that we see is how do we actually get to measuring those ultimate outcomes of adaptation we want to get, whereas it is easier to measure and have metrics for kind of the process as you go along the way and getting there, and of those outputs that would be kind of tangible things there that come out. But really ultimately we want to make sure that we have the outcomes for adaptation that we really are aiming for and ultimately affect people's lives on the ground in the end there. So I think what we see we need to be doing is how we can be balancing the context specificity of it, because it is so important that we figure out to measure what are those things that are important to people in specific places and in specific sectors that they're working in, while at the same time being able to have the more, to be able to generalize this, as I think Henry made, and completely agree, across the scales there that we can aggregate up from the local up to the national scale, and to be able to compare across different places, different systems, and even in the end, different sectors, really, to be able to have a comprehensive view on adaptation. But then the challenge there is how do we balance the importance of the context on the one hand with the challenge of the context on the other hand.
Thank you, Evan. I think that's, you're conveying challenges, right? And we don't have the solutions, but by articulating them, I think it really gets us closer to being able to know what we need to really emphasize and focus on over the next few years. I'd like to now move the discussion a bit over to some opportunities for providing solutions, just by thinking of the experiences of a couple of the panelists in trying to both identify, what are the challenges, but then how in their particular contexts are they working to address these. And I'd like to start from the perspective of national systems and ask Michaela, who's with the OECD and has been doing some very interesting work assessing national systems, in particular for OECD countries, but I think it has relevance, as we've discussed, in all country contexts as well. What do you see are being the real opportunities to overcome these questions of aggregation at the national scale, and what might it mean for reporting to the global stocktake?
Thank you very much, Carl. So yeah, indeed, many challenges that need to be overcome in terms of measuring adaptation at the national level. At the OECD, what we've heard is that there's a very strong country demand to get guidance on this topic. And there's also a clear willingness to better track adaptation. What we see is that all OECD countries refer to adaptation in their indices, but at different levels. Very limited number include information on how to better track adaptation. And so there's a clear intention to set measurement framework also in the national adaptation plans of OECD countries. But even though most OECD countries have a national adaptation plan and indicate that they want to have measurement frameworks in it, they don't necessarily and systematically track their implementation. And why so? Many of the challenges were cited previously, and I'd like to pick up on the point that Henry made on the climate change risk framework of the IPCC. Indeed, you need to have an emphasis on how to reduce exposure and vulnerability. And for that, you need to look at what are the different adaptation action. And building on your point, you need to look at how to move from the processes to measuring the processes. So, for instance, how many... so in terms of input, for instance, how much do you allocate to flood defense, to moving to how to better measure outcomes. And for outcomes, there are much fewer examples of, for instance, how do you reduce the casualty from heat-related stress. And this is something, if we know that we need to measure this over the long term, more and more countries will be assessing this, and so we'll be getting there. And related to the use of metrics, what's difficult to grasp is whether they are fit for purpose, and how can countries set up indicator frameworks or different metric framework that do not create false incentives and that are rightly connected to the objectives, not only at the national level on how to reach a specific objective for at the country level, but how it is reducing vulnerability and exposure, and thereby increasing resilience. And final point I'd like to make is related to this this discussion around outcome, is also how do you measure the effectiveness of the policy intervention. And how do you ensure that there's a causality between implementing a certain adaptation action and which is reaching the intended and desired outcome in the end, which is very difficult. And I hope through a number of case studies that we'll undertake that we are going to help bring some light to this. Thank you.
Thank you, Michaela. I think this raises a lot of questions, but also it shows, there's real tractable ways that you're looking to address how we can deal with these different contexts. I'd like to now ask Alexandra, who has been working through the Gap Track initiative to come up with real solutions related to, well, yes, they are, related to how we can really understand at a sectoral level, at a broader aggregated level, a whole breadth of different sectoral questions, issues, coastal, what have you. So,
yeah, thanks, Carl. Indeed, this question of the metrics, which are the right metrics for which scale and which kind of purpose, and how to aggregate the metrics is always so difficult, and maybe there is no clear answer on that. So. So we started to think at IDDRI at another kind of approach with a focus on the global level directly, and try to, well, the other issue with the metrics is that it's difficult to identify some metrics for the different dimensions of adaptation and then bring them together in order to be able to say something consistent across the metrics, because the different metrics, they use different tools, different things. Some are quantitative, some are qualitative, and sometimes it's difficult to, okay, we have a lot of material and it's difficult to have a clear view of what all together they are saying. So, so we started to develop something around expert judgment exercise, because I developed this kind of thing for the IPCC, or we also have some kind of things in the adaptation gap report, for example. And the expert judgment is based on the scoring system, and this scoring system is a way to define a language which is common to different types of information. And of different nature. So this is the kind of thing we can try to develop. We started to do that, but there is some promising way here. Just a few points on what is needed from the science in terms of innovative metrics. I think you're right, Henry. We know a lot on, well, we know, yeah, a lot on exposure and vulnerability, but we still lack some metrics able to inform us on the very human dimensions of vulnerability, for example. We don't know exactly what is the point, even at local scales, but also at national and regional and global, about risk perception, for example. We don't have so much information on that, or risk tolerance, or this kind of information is quite critical for adaptation. So this is the first point. The other point is I would like to insist again on points that my colleagues raised earlier. We don't have evidence on the effectiveness of what we are doing in terms of adaptation for risk reduction, and we need metrics on that. I mean, it's critical. This is the silver bullet of the adaptation topic. Well, I have many points, but I can stop here.
Thank you for that, Anya. Anya, I'd like to ask you, as a person who has developed specific metrics for your initiative, amazing initiative, that is bringing in a breadth of different stakeholders who want to do something to be more resilient, better adapted. And you've been developing metrics for this diverse group I'd like to, of course, if you have anything you want to say about the solution, by all means say that. But I'd like to also move this, as we're nearing the end of my little section here, to ask the question about how do you think dealing with non-scientific parties, how can we make a better match between the solutions of science and innovation, things that you may be working on, but how does this really work for the users of metrics, your stakeholders, those who buy into the race to resilience?
Thanks very much for the question, Carl. So just to give a small bit of background on my work and what I'm doing. So I lead on the metrics for the Race to Resilience campaign, which, as most of you know, was launched in January this year by the high-level climate champions, Nigel Topping and Gonzalo Munoz. And the overall campaign goal is by 2030 to catalyse action by non-state actors to build the resilience of 4 billion people from groups and communities who are vulnerable to climate change. And over the past year, we've had 25 initiatives join and sign up to the campaign, and all of them, as part of signing up to the campaign, have agreed to provide metrics on their efforts. And so we've developed a metrics framework in order to measure the efforts of our partners. And the scope of this is on people and hectares of natural systems. And the focus is on increased resilience. So this was put together, supported by McKinsey, but it is now being technically supported by the Center for Climate and Resilience Research at the University of Chile, who really brought in a lot of background and work from the IPCC, including making sure that the whole framework is reflective of the IPCC climate change risk framework as well. And so the metric framework really is quite critical for the success of the campaign. You can't set out a big target like that without having a robust framework to back it up. And we have several aims for it. We really wanted to enable ambitious campaign goals, to record and track pledges and results, to identify gaps that need to be filled by new or existing initiatives, and really to ensure that the data is reliable and that the campaign is credible. But beyond this, we also think that there's a space that this framework could fill for, to become more widely adapted framework across a wide range of non-state actors, from businesses to investors, other key sectors. But the framework doesn't do everything. It doesn't provide an exhaustive list of climate resilience metrics beneath each high-level outcome. It doesn't aggregate depth. For example, it wouldn't tell you how much more resilient is an individual. It doesn't act as a policing mechanism or any kind of central database. And we're well aware that resilience is quite context-specific and initiative-specific. So in order to kind of aggregate and compile statistics, what we're doing is we're asking initiatives to assign their outcome-based actions to either the 9 Marrakesh Partnership climate actions from the resilience pathway, or the 10 IPCC AR 5 actions typology. So we really don't want to reinvent the wheel here. We're trying to converge efforts, and we're trying to make the cornerstone of our development using pre-existing categories that have already been agreed and are in use within the community. And we want to align with both scientific and non-state actor processes. And similarly, in all of our classification efforts, we've done something very similar. We've used pre-existing classifications, such as the ILO occupations, for example. And we were really keen to work more closely with IPAM and with others in the community, the Adaptation Metrics community, to help all of our initiatives and our partners to implement this over the coming years as the campaign runs up till 2030.
Well, thank you. We're very happy to work with you. I'd like to just ask one final question, and it's for someone who is clearly representing the research community, but has a particular perspective on it that IPAM's a member of. We're very happy to be. We're very happy to sign up to the principles of the Adaptation Research Alliance. But I'd like to ask you this final question on really how does science, how does research become usable, become tractable for the users and the stakeholders who are vulnerable?
Thanks. Thank you. There we go. Okay. Thanks, Carl. Well, the short answer is I wish I knew. That would be great. But the more serious answer, because that's a fundamental question for the Adaptation Research Alliance, how does it become usable? I think the most straightforward answer is ask. And ask the end users of research, or ask the end users of the metrics that are being developed. What do they actually need them for? And this is where I think one of the key aspects as a part of this discussion is what is the end use of these metrics? You know, what do we actually need them for? And this is where I think the learning agenda comes in as being a critical component of being to actually be able to understand what we are doing in terms of adaptation actions by 2030. You know, how can we improve from where we are today and our knowledge, our evidence base, but also the actions that we're implementing today, and how can we improve by 2030? So it's not just reducing the vulnerability, increasing the resilience of those vulnerable communities, but how can we actually improve as we go?
Well, thank you for that. I think that those are useful guiding principles that we should be taking on board as we go forward. I'm going to wrap up this panel, but we'll be back at the end to just give a few closing remarks. So I'd just like to thank all of you. I think it was a delight, and Henry in Denmark, thank you for your inputs as well. And I look forward to further collaboration with all of you.
I will invite now the panelists of next panel to already take place. I'm talking about Alex, Godfrey Fernandez, Luali Garba, Jeremy Hewitt, and Dauda Ndiaye. And meanwhile, I will give the word to the COP26 presidency, and Janet Rogan, the regional ambassador for the Middle East and North Africa, Eastern Europe and Central Asia, unfortunately couldn't make it today, but we're very happy to have with us Jenny Pierce, who leads the UK presidency COP work in the British Embassy in Morocco. Please, Jenny, welcome for your welcoming words.
Evening. My laptop has chosen this moment to stop working, so it's going to be an interesting experiment in how well I know my remarks. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I want to just extend the welcome of the UK presidents that Janet would have brought to you, and she sends her regrets. This is a really, really crucial topic, and it's one we've been very proud to support in Morocco, working with the International Platform on Adaptation Metrics, and I'll mention that again later. But just to give a nod to Minister, Our Excellency Mr. Baraka, who spoke earlier, Mr. Abdallah Moqsit, the IPCC General Secretary, and all of you in the audience, some of you IPAM members, some of you not. I mean, we know how important this is. We know the difficulty of not having a consensus on adaptation metrics. We know the underfunding of adaptation. It's one of the biggest issues at this COP. It's what the July ministerial led off on, and it's what we know people in rooms are expending incredibly important energy and time on, trying to come to solutions. And the presidency is committed to a good balanced outcome on adaptation that reflects the collective will that wants to see that balance in the right place. And one of the challenges, as you know, as the panel's been saying very eloquently, is about getting the metrics right. We know how much climate change is affecting landscapes and communities and reshaping in economies. Minister Baraka highlighted water as one of the particular aspects, and this afternoon in the Moroccan pavilion we were looking at the potential impacts on agriculture by 2050, the potential reductions in crop yields, in water availability. And I think it's just one example of how important the evidence base always is for action. And we're extremely good, the UK globally, everybody, at modeling climate impacts. And this is about getting to that place with adaptation metrics, because we know that evidence drives action. One of the things that Janet was going to talk about was just a local example. She was with us in July, and she was in the High Atlas in Morocco in the community of Zouait Ahensal, which is an extremely remote community, probably about 5 hours drive in practice from Marrakesh. That's an already harsh and challenging climate. It's getting more challenging because of climate change. But one of the examples there is how there's a women's cooperative that led by a relatively recent graduate who has gone home, and they're extending crop yields by adding thyme, the herb thyme, into the mix there, significantly extending what they can grow locally. And so they're effectively choosing their own adaptation metrics. So water used, length of the growing system, crop yields, income generated, all of these things. You know, this is what's happening locally in very real communities. And that illustrates the things that the first panel was talking about. I'm sure the second panel will also, which is adaptation is locally and context specific. And that's one of the reasons the metrics are so challenging but so important. And they're important, as I think the last speaker but one was saying, also about the learning agenda, about shaping not just action now and driving finance now, but shaping action in the future. So I think we really don't underestimate what a crucial part of the debate is. As I said, you know, there's discussions in other rooms about the balance of funding and increasing that for adaptation. You know, what we know will cost a lot now will cost even more if we don't do it now and we do it later. But a massive part of that is this piece on the evidence base to drive action. Minister Baraka said, talking about Morocco's mitigation targets on the NDC, that we can commit to it because we can measure it. And one of the big targets here, and there was a reference to end use, and I'm not the expert, but I know one of the biggest challenges is, you know, it's getting banks and financed institutions, not just multilateral development partners, to fund this when it's so much easier for them to get their heads around mitigation work. And in that vein, finally, I'm pleased to just mention again, we've been able to support some work by IPAM through the UK's North Africa Technical Assistance Facility to elaborate an adaptation metrics mapping and evaluation framework. And that's going to be presented in the Moroccan Pavilion tomorrow. I'm an unofficial Moroccan these days. And so do come along if you're interested in that work, come along and look at that. But we're also really delighted as the presidency piece in Morocco to see the AAA and IPAM, and I'm sure many more of you in this room, really actively engaged in the Adaptation Research Alliance, which has been building up over the year but was formally launched this morning. And on that note, I will leave you to the next panel.
Hello, everyone.
For this panel, I'm just introducing very quickly from the left side of the scene to the right one. Mr. Ayman Shakawi from the Foundation Mohammed VI for Environment Protection is with us. Mr. Daouda Ndiaye from the Islamic Development Bank. Mr. Louali Garba from the African Bank of Development. Mr. Jeremy Hewitt from the Government of British Columbia. We also have with us Professor Margot Herbert from the University of Regina, and Mr. Ioannis Vassiliou from the World Bank Group. I will ask Ms. Herbert and Mr. Ioannis Vassiliou to turn on their camera, to be on. And the panel will be moderated by Alex from the sorry, it's always too long to say. From the United Nations Sustainable Development Solution Network and from the Andes part of it. Thank you.
Thanks, Karim, and hello everyone. I am delighted to stay here because I have a lot of friends from Morocco. I think it is a very, very prestigious initiative about the adaptation metrics because it's interesting. I am part of the IPCC, and always we talk about the mitigation, and always to talk mitigation, and always we are trying to get funding for mitigation. But right now, maybe in 2-3 COPs, the adaptation is key. You know, I come from Chile, it's in the south, and in Africa, when you are traveling from Africa, from Asia, and maybe the main challenge are the adaptation right now. Indeed, there are people suffering, and we are creating inequities. So, and about the links between science indicators, I would like to start the discussion with you, and maybe starting for Mr. Jeremy Hewitt. I'm sorry for my spelling. I know, I remember I am speaking Spanish. And what is in your view regarding to the level of involvement of the government and the civil society, defining metrics and indicators, and how we can reduce the gaps about the knowledge about the adaptation indicators, because in my perception, the academics, when we talk about indicators, we're thinking in one kind of things, but in the civil society, maybe things different. How we can reduce the gaps between both worlds?
Well, thanks for the question, and it is great to be here. I'll say I've learned more so far in this panel than I have in any other so far this year. So the province of British Columbia, just for context, we're on the Pacific coast of Canada, population of about 5.2 million people, and a landmass the size of, well, about 12 times the size of Scotland. And in BC this year, we saw unprecedented forest fires for the 3rd year in a row, and in fact, an entire community burnt to the ground in approximately 15 or 20 minutes as a result of one of those fires. So it's very much on the top of people's minds in Canada. While I think you're right, you know, we have mostly been thinking about GHG mitigation up to this point. I mean, the last panelist had a comment around, you know, how do we know what metrics are? Just ask. Well, I'll say as a government official, for us, we do have a climate preparedness and adaptation strategy, several actions across 13 ministries. We have a legislated requirement to report annually to the public and to Parliament on the progress of this plan. And we are just in the early stages now of figuring out the metrics we use, the evaluative framework we use, et cetera. So that's why I'm just really interested to be here to provide that perspective and hopefully to be able to make some connections with the other folks in the room. The other piece, of course, is we need to be able to demonstrate to British Columbians, to public, that we are taking the right steps and they're making a tangible difference in people's lives. And then finally, if we want these programs to be funded through our Treasury board, we need to be able to speak their language to a certain extent as well, right? And that has been a big challenge, is how do we talk about adaptation spending in a more traditional cost-benefit way that a Treasury department might think of other spending priorities. So those are some thoughts in the quick 2 minutes, and yeah, hoping to meet a few people after.
Thank you, Jeremy. Taking advantage that here we have I'm sorry for my spelling, Loali from the, African Bank of Development. Yeah. And Daura and Diare, because I would like to produce the same question for both. When we talk about adaptation, the adaptation is different in different regions, and we need metrics. And sometimes we are trying to converge the metrics in just one or two, or defining metrics for specific cases, but nobody's are thinking in the specific or characteristics in different countries, in different regions. So my question is, what could you require from the scientists and the science to move ahead in adaptation initiatives? And what kind of metrics you need for mobilize the climate finance in your region? Please, and Luali, or?
Okay, thanks for the question, and also for giving us the opportunity to respond on this and to come in this discussion. Let's say that as an African Development Bank, we know that we are working on maybe some of the most vulnerable regions in terms of climate change. Like we are working in Sahel, in the Horn of Africa, and also in the south. And in this region also, one of the characteristics is that we have small farmers or pastoralists, which also are very poor. So the level of poverty is very high, and the government has limited resources. So one of the key point, I think, the anti-point on what can be useful is for the decision of the investment. The first question is that when you have the majority of the population which is vulnerable, so which population or which groups will be prioritized? So it is very important to see if it is possible to have a kind of index which can assess very easily and characterize the level of the vulnerability of the population. So it is based on this that we can select easily which population will be, or which group will be prioritized, so who will be the beneficiary of the investment. So I think this is an entry point. A second aspect in terms of this decision of investment is also how much it costs. When you're talking about today, when you want to build the resilience or you want to support a farmers to adapt, how much it costs, dependent of the context, of socioeconomic context of the country, the ecological characteristic of the region. So this is very important to quickly say that, okay, you have this population and this is the investment which is required, or if you have a budget to know exactly how many people will be selected to be beneficiary for this project and to be efficient. So I think for the decision of the investment, this is very important. Now the second aspect is that when we invest, we need also to measure the efficiency of this investment. So because at the end of the day, to say that we have built the resilience of a number of farmers, or we have supported a number of farmers to adapt. But exactly when we are talking about farmers who adapt, what is the definition of it? How do you decide, how do you characterize the level of adaptation of this farmer to say that, okay, this farmer is okay, or he is resilient, so we can continue to another. So this is something, and this is what to determine exactly if this investment is efficient. So the effectiveness of the using of this resources and the impact. How to measure the impact? Well, at any time in project, we are using this vocabulary to say that, okay, we have a number of farmers resilient to climate change. But exactly what is the content of can you have an index which can allow us to say that, okay, so based on this index, these farmers or this pastoralist is now resilient to climate change because of the project. So I think these are, two perspectives that can be useful for investment development bank and helping us in the design and in the monitoring of our project. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Thank you. Yeah, I think my colleague mentioned something very, very important in terms of impact indicators. Now I will go maybe to the side of the input indicator. As a bank, we discuss here during the negotiation a lot about climate finance and adaptation finance. Adaptation finance is a key indicator as well for us as MDBs. And we have collectively developed a framework, a methodology to calculate our adaptation finance. And how it shows, to get back to your question, talking about the differences in regions, we don't necessarily see, big differences in terms of adaptation in regions. We see differences in climate hazards that are more important in this this category of climate hazards would be more seen in this region, and this other category, so this is more the way we would see it, and then the way we address those climate hazards and those climate impacts are going to be through a different set of adaptation measures that we would include in our operations. But then the way it reflects as an input in terms of monetary, it could be either calculated through looking at the incremental costs, the incremental cost of adaptation, or in some cases where it's not easy to find that incremental cost, we would look at we would have a proportional approach to see how much of the whole investment can be considered as adaptation. So this would complement this aspect of looking at the impact at the end, but first having an input that would give you an idea of how much I am putting as part of for adapting, this project, or for adapting these communities is a first step. Thank you.
Thank you for that. We are on flexible and online and face-to-face. I would like to ask to Margot Hulbert. She's online and she has some troubles with her camera. And I would like to ask you, Margot, about the, we have a lot of indicators, and but they are not commonly accepted unified metrics applicable across sectors and scales. So how we can reduce how we can define or unify metrics in different contexts, sectors, and scales, or right now, you have raised to resilience and adaptation. So how we can make the unification of this kind of indicators? Margot?
We should move to the next question. I think
She said,
transmission points.
okay. No, Margot cannot and listen to us. Okay. Go to Mr. Ayman Sharkawi. You are member of the Foundation Mohammed for the Protection of the Environment.
Mohammed VI for environmental protection, yes.
Yes, and for my spelling. And about the funding, and how you can decide allocation of funding, or how we can protect, or how we can think about it, metrics. What are more useful metrics, or what could be your recommendation for the scientists about the metrics and adaptation?
If that's okay with you, I'll be taking your question in a slightly different direction. So yes, I'm with the Mohammed VI Foundation for Environmental Protection. We have actually a close collaboration with the SDSN. We did some global school projects in Morocco. It was a pilot project there. Very happy about this particular partnership. When it comes to adaptation and mitigation, the foundation has a series of projects in Morocco where we look at oceans, for example, and climate, where we look at renewable energy and energy efficiency. We recently launched a task force to decarbonize the Moroccan economy in close collaboration with the Ministry of Industry and Trade, the Ministry of Sustainable Energy, Energy Transition and Sustainable Development, the private sector, the agency for the CGIAR is called, this particular institution, the agency for the Moroccan Agency for Energy Efficiency, and the National Institute for Norms and Standards. And one of the first things we'll be doing is looking at data. In particular, but this is more linked at this point in time to mitigation, but of course we'll also explore elements connected to adaptation. So today, before I proceed further, I wanted to acknowledge Karim, Riyad, as well, of course, as Rashid, that have been working really hard, both Rashid actually, both Rashid that are here with us, that have been really working really hard on this, but in particular, of course, Jenny. Jenny, because she's been particularly engaged based in Rabat on a lot of the work we've done in the context of COP26, and want to acknowledge that. Thank you very much, Jenny, for your support. So regarding the direction that I wanted to take a bit our conversation towards, it's not directly linked to the foundation, but it's linked to something else that I did this morning. So today, yesterday was Adaptation Day, officially, Adaptation and Loss and Damages, and I'm very happy that we kept that dynamic and are still talking about adaptation, although officially we're not on the day of adaptation, so I think that's good. But I was already talking about adaptation today at an event in the EU Pavilion this morning, where we launched an important partnership between Adaptation Without Borders and the EU when it comes to looking at adaptation specifically in Africa for the first year, next year. And the reason why I wanted to refer to that particular event is twofold. First, it's out of, I would say, intellectual honesty, as in that event I also refer to the importance of the AAA initiative and looking at metrics in general, but also because this initiative is interested about risk. Is looking at risk, and as I'm speaking about right after two bankers, I think risk is going to be speaking quite a bit, and it's a good connection to what they were talking about. So this particular Adaptation Without Borders was formed to, in close collaboration with stakeholders worldwide, identify and assess cross-border climate risks, appraise policy options to better manage those risks, and develop climate-resilient solutions that enhance preparedness, strengthen resilience, and minimize the potential for maladaptation. As you can imagine, metrics are critical to each one of those aspects. If our connections to each other expose us to the international nature of climate risks, they also present a seminal opportunity to work together to shape an inclusive and sustainable path to the future. Greater recognition of cross-border and cascading climate risk could, 1, provide a strong incentive for countries to raise their level of ambitions, investment, and cooperative action on both adaptation and mitigation. 2, help build resilience in ways that are just and fair and don't unwittingly protect some at the expense of the other. I want to talk about something a bit more specific in terms of the kind of examples we're talking about, what potentially we could be measuring. And the example I would like to provide is linked to agriculture and trade. So we know a bit about the local impacts of climate change on agriculture. Of course, we still need to learn more about this in the global south and in Africa in particular, but we have developed some measure of knowledge. There is, however, another aspect that we have failed to look at and understand in depth, the impact of climate change on globally traded agricultural commodities and the impact that this will have on the food security of people, particularly in import-dependent countries. For example, millions of people around the world rely on internationally traded staple crops like rice, maize, wheat for their food security. Production of these crops will be severely impacted by climate change. Global maize production might fall by 25 to 30%, and this risk is exported by major producing countries to many import-dependent ones, some of whom are critically dependent on just a small basket of trade partners. So this is an invitation to look again at those kind of metrics, as they are quite pertinent in terms of connecting agriculture, trade, and adaptation, of course.
We know from previous global food cost crisis that some countries react to shocks by panic buying or banning exports. But this kind of adaptation exacerbates risk for other players in the market. To a large extent, what we're trying to do in the context, for example, of adaptation without borders is moving from a zero-sum framing to a strongly collaborative non-zero-sum one. As an international community, we are only as resilient as the most vulnerable among us. So that's what I wanted to say about this. I'm quite aware of time. The last thing I wanted to say is just acknowledge a bit of an issue, is that we are a bit of a manual right now. In terms of gender balance, that's not exactly great, but I wanted to acknowledge that and apologize about it to the extent that I can, being a speaker here. Thank you.
Thanks. My last question is for Ioannis Basileo, who is online and he's ready. And nice to meet you, Ioannis, and member of the World Bank Group. The last question is, okay, and what kind of metrics do we need in the perspective of looking for standardized tools to ease the mobilization of climate finance for adaptation projects?
Thank you, Alex, and thanks to the organizers and to the fellow panelists as well. I think some of my colleagues in the other multilateral development banks, they mentioned the way that we measure in the banks the amount of finance that goes to adaptation in this sense, and in this case, and this is the climate co-benefit. So there is an agreed methodology between the banks for almost a decade now, since 2012. The way that we measure the climate finance, and this has actually helped a lot ourselves and our clients to mainstream and incentivize climate action. But we have seen some major limitations with that. First of all, it's an input-based metric. So as some of my colleagues mentioned, it doesn't cover impacts, and especially overall impacts, not just climate, but also different development purposes. It also it's currently delinked from long-term resilience and low carbon development strategies of countries, and this is a major limitation. So given these challenges, we're in the bank and together with other MDBs in the process of developing ways how to deal with this. And one of the things that we have been doing in the World Bank since last year is to develop a resilience rating system. And this is, at least in my knowledge, one of the first times that something like this is going to be put together. And right now we are actually developing this resilience rating system, and it has two dimensions. It measures, it assesses projects for resilience in terms of project design and how climate risks might impact the project performance, but also in terms of resilience through the project and how project beneficiaries could be, how the project impacts project beneficiaries towards become more resilient. And this system hopefully is going to be available also to private project developers and investors as well. But at the same time, I think another process that we have been working together with other MDBs has to do with the Paris alignment. The alignment, developing an alignment methodology for aligning our investment project with the Paris Agreement. And I think this is extremely important because we have to find a way to link our adaptation metrics in this case with long-term climate change strategies for countries. Of course, we might meet other challenges with that. The current discussion is about developing a binary Paris alignment metric that wouldn't touch issues about climate ambition, and this is something that we should look at in the future as well. Finally, some thoughts about the future. I think some of the important things that we have been looking at the World Bank and together with other MDBs is to really develop multidimensional metrics that cover adaptation, but also touch upon other issues that MDBs are traditionally targeting through investment projects, and this has to do with economic, environmental, and social objectives. It's also very important to develop composite metrics between adaptation and mitigation, because as we know, a climate solution has to touch upon both issues. And finally, an idea that we have been discussing is to expand climate metrics to include also green metrics in a way, and in that way include also metrics to capture natural positive solutions, etc. In the short term, in the bank, we have 5 requirements in place for any other investment project, and one of these has to do with climate and disaster risk screening that any other investment project, together with our clients, has to implement. And the second requirement, which is also going beyond the climate co-benefits metric, has to do with the obligation for any other investment project to include at least one climate-specific indicator for any other project that yields more than 20% of climate co-benefits. So with this kind of short summary, I hope I was able to capture where we're currently standing in terms of climate, but also specifically adaptation metrics in the World Bank. And I think this also gives, in a way, some context about where the broader discussion between MDBs in terms of adaptation metrics is standing right now. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ioannis. I would really appreciate your presence here, so I would like to say thank you. And Karim?
Sorry, because we have really limited time. I will invite Carl to come up to join Alex for the wrap-up and the final words. Thank you, sirs.
To say thank you in the name of Kingdom of Morocco, and thanks for the environment. And I would like to put some notes about the donors and in a few words. And we need to try to unify the indicators and metrics, because finally we need trying to drive the climate finance and adaptation and properly according for the adaptation needs, and is linking to the climate hazards and how say